Hello. If I were to pick one of the most controversial subjects that a believer can talk about, it has to be speaking in tongues. It's controversial. Many people say it's psychosomatic, made up, not real, but it's a lie from the pit of hell. It's totally real, as I said in an earlier video. A lot of times when you speak in tongues, you're speaking in somebody else's own language. And that can totally blow a person away, and they can get saved because you're doing that. On the day of Pentecost was being fulfilled, all the disciples were gathered in one place. Suddenly they heard the sound of a violent blast of wind rushing the house from out of the heavenly realm. The roar of the wind was so overpowering, it was all anyone could bear. Then all at once a pillar of fire appeared before their eyes. It separated into tongues of fire that engulfed each one of them. They were all filled and equipped with the Holy Spirit and were inspired to speak in tongues, empowered by the Spirit to speak in languages they never learned. Tongues is not a language that is learned. It's empowered by the Spirit. Now, at the time, there were Jewish worshippers who immigrated from many different lands to live in Jerusalem. When the people of the city heard the roaring sound, crowds came running to where it was coming from, stunned over what was happening because each one could hear the disciples speaking in his or her own language. Bewildered, they said to one another, "Are these not all Galileans? So how is it that we hear them speaking in our own languages? We are northern Iranians, northwestern Iranians, Edomites, and those from Mesopotamia, Judea, East Central, and Turkey, the coastal area of the Black Sea, Asia, and the north central Turkey, southern Turkey, Egypt, Liberians, and who are neighbors of Cyrene, visitors from all over the Roman Empire, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Christians and Arabs. Yet we hear them speaking of God mighty wonders in our own dialects." They all stood there, dumbfounded and astonished, saying to one another, "What is this phenomenon?" And this phenomenon is being totally filled with the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues. A lot of times, it's somebody else's own language. In this video, we'll look at that. You will see a lady speaking in tongues in Chinese. Well, she's a Chinese lady speaking in tongues in English. You'll also see a testimony by Christina Willens. You also will see a testimony by Chuck Smith. And you will see that many times, tongues is of somebody's own dialect. And it's a wonder. A wonderful wonder from the Holy Spirit. And it's a wonder why most people don't speak in tongues at all. Like I said later on, if I speak in tongues of men and of angels, a lot of times tongues is a man, but a lot of times it's the angelic language. And it's there to build up the believer. We should all speak in tongues.
Yeah. I love you. Oh my God. Yeah.
You never seen me before?
Look at right here. Look at her. She's speaking in English, bro, and she doesn't understand. For those that are watching right now, she is speaking in English. I love you. Yeah. My heart.
Feel my heart.
My heart. Take me. Take my heart. She has said, I love you. Take my heart. Please take my heart. Please take my heart. Please take my heart. Oh my She was speaking in English.
他的方言是英文。
She was saying, "Please God, take my heart."
对，他说神啊，然后接受我的心，我爱你，父啊，我爱你 ，Father I love you， 父啊，我爱你，英文的。
And then Milena, who lives in Italy, all happened to be there this time. And it was sovereign. And so Milena, she's a gifted artist and she's a cake maker, Phyllis. So she gave me this. I'll let you see this afterwards. It's in pencil, a picture of Jesus watching over the sheep. But just remarkable that God would put us all back together. And guess what? She still doesn't speak English. She's fluent in Bulgarian and fluent in Italian and doesn't speak English, but still in her prayer language, prays in English. Is that the craziest thing in the world? So you talk to her, but she understands a little bit, but cannot speak back to you. Is that crazy? How God, but I was so grateful to God that he reconnected us all this time. It was miraculous, really.
I can't remember if it was 68 or 69, but as we were meeting on Pentecost Sunday, and at that time there was probably 45 to 50 of us on Sunday evenings, and we were able to have a much more informal Bible study. I just sat with them and we just shared the scriptures. We were going through the Bible even then, but it was in a very informal way. And at the end of the study, because there was just a very small group of us, as I say, only 50, 60 or so, I said, you know, this is Pentecost Sunday, the Sunday that we celebrate the coming of the Holy Spirit and the birth of the church. And we had a lady in our fellowship, her name was Lynn, who had a remarkable gift of tongues in that whenever she speaks in tongues, she speaks in French. And so I said, you know, let's just worship the Lord. And Lynn, why don't you just exercise your gift that God has given to you of speaking in tongues, because there's just us here, and it is Pentecost Sunday, and just, you know, as sort of a memorial, this is Pentecost Sunday. So as Lynn began to speak in tongues, speaking in French, I can understand enough of French that I knew that she was giving thanks to God for a beautiful song. Now, because I could intellectually understand some of the French words, I did not make any endeavor to exercise my gift of interpretation, because I was afraid of trying to interpret when naturally I knew some of the words, had sort of the gist of what she was saying naturally, and I was afraid of some kind of a natural, supernatural kind of a hang-up. I might get out into na-na land and not come back, you know, between the two. So I didn't make any endeavor to interpret. However, Kay began to interpret. And it was very beautiful as she was thanking God for the beautiful new song that God had put in her heart. Her love song to Him. And the joy and the blessing of singing of her love for Him. And of course it was rather significant because she had been singing in nightclubs and did have a beautiful voice. And so it was quite significant that she was rejoicing in a new song that God had given to her, a song of praise and love and all unto Him. We closed the meeting and we had a fellow who was going with this girl in Palm Springs, and she was having some problems. And he brought her down that night that I might counsel with her after the service. So as we sat down to counsel, she was a Jewish girl. She said, before we start talking about the things that I need to talk to you about, she said, I'm curious as to what was going on here tonight at the end. The woman who spoke to the group in French and the other woman who translated for the group what she said. And I said, would you believe that neither of those women know French? She said, no, I wouldn't. And I said, well, it's true. I said, neither of them know French. And I took her to the scriptures and I showed her the gift of speaking in tongues and the gift of interpretation. I said, what you saw was this, what Paul is talking about here in Corinthians, where one speaks in an unknown tongue and another interprets. She said, well, I lived for 5 years in Paris. She said she was speaking the most beautiful French. She said she was using an aristocratic pronunciation. She said it isn't just the common French. She said she had an aristocratic pronunciation. I said, well, what you expect from the Lord, you know. And she said the other lady translated it perfectly. I said, well, I know that she doesn't know French. That's my wife. She said, well, before we go any further, I have to receive the Lord. And so we had the joy of leading her to the Lord as the result of that experience of seeing the genuine exercise of the gift. And here is one of those cases where tongues did become a sign to an unbeliever, as she saw the gift of tongues and the interpretation. It used to be that I spent my vacations in Arizona, in Williams, Arizona, conducting youth camps. That was the only way I could afford on a vacation, because they would give us, of course, our lodging and our food, and so we would go over and I'd conduct these camps in Arizona, and it gave the family a great opportunity to be up there in the beautiful mountains of Arizona around Williams, go over to the Grand Canyon and all. And so every summer I would take my vacation conducting and directing their youth camps there. And we were getting ready to go over. It was summertime, and I was going to take my 2-week vacation over there. And so at this particular year, our daughter Jan, who has had 5 years of French, she took French at UCI and quite fluent in French. She was going to be a girls' counselor at that camp. And so the family, it was after Sunday night, and of course that was before we even moved out of the little church, and so we had even less there that night, maybe 30 or 40 of us. It's just shortly after 6 months or so after we had started Calvary Chapel. So that the family, we went down, and the church gathered around us, laid hands on us, and prayed for us that God would be with us, use us, and bless us in the ministry to these young people in Arizona. And Lynn happened to lay her hands on Jan and began to pray in the Spirit for her. Now, of course, the interesting thing was that Jan could understand it because she was praying in French. And she was praying that God would help Jan to be a very beautiful witness to these young girls. That God's love would just pour forth from Jan and would make her just a great blessing. And that the impressions that these girls received would be lifelong impressions as a result of her ministry to them. And as she was going on praying for Jan, Jan said, "Dad, I just felt just sort of trembling all over because I realized that this is what the Holy Spirit was praying for me." As Paul said, the Spirit makes intercession according to the will of God. And she said, realizing that, Lynn, not really knowing what she was praying, because she was praying in an unknown tongue to her, yet to Jan, she understood it and said, what a thrill to realize this is what the Holy Spirit was praying for me, interceding for me. And she said, it just was so glorious to know that this is the Lord's desire and prayer for me.